All right, so we are continuing in Genesis with Genesis chapter 38, and wow, what a brutal passage. But guys, I believe that God's put this text in here and He wants us to look at it. He wants our eyes focused on it. And there are some themes in here that are certainly very adult, not necessarily kid friendly. And so parents, you're just going to have to navigate that as you're sharing it with your kids and some of these things. But the lessons and what God, I think, is communicating here, there is so much here. I'm worried that I'm not going to do it justice. But we have a kind of a meanwhile back with the family. So Joseph gets sent off to Egypt, and we're going to pick it back up with him next week. But this is like a meanwhile, what's going on with Judah? And we have this really dark story. And it starts off with highlighting that Judah left where the family was and starts hanging out with the Canaanites. That's warning number one, that Judah is not going in a good direction spiritually in his walk with God. He sees a woman, marries her, just right out of the bat, has 3 boys with her. As soon as one of the boys grows up, he finds a wife for her. Her name is Tamar. And it says in verse 6 that we don't know why, but God kills him because he was evil. Verse 7, he was evil in the Lord's sight. The Lord put him to death. We don't know why, but man, there was something messed up about him. And then something strange happened that is very different from our culture. But in those ancient times, they had this system called the levirate marriage, and what that was a way of achieving 2 things. Number one, the bloodline, the descendants of who is going to inherit the father's estate. The families, all those kinds of things. It was a super communal society, and so that was super important that the firstborn son, that the inheritance came to him and that he continued on the heritage of the family. And so if he died, his wife now was a widow, and the way it worked was, okay, the next son that's not married, he has to marry her to continue on the heritage there. And so that's what they did. They was like, okay, here's the second son, you can have her. You go to her, and then we're going to continue that. The second purpose of this levirate marriage was a means of provision for widows, because widows were super vulnerable. They wouldn't typically get remarried. That would be very, very uncommon. How are they provide for? Your husband and your offspring, the children, the family. That is how women would be provided for, especially in their older age. It wasn't like our economy today where you could go get a job or support yourself. They didn't have that in those days. And so they had this system in place in order to provide for people in need. And so that's what the levirate marriage was for, to provide that. So first son gets killed by God because he's evil. The second son, he's like, all right, I'll do my duty. But it turns out he just uses her for his own sexual pleasure, but doesn't provide for her the way that he's supposed to provide for her. Verse 10 says that what he did was evil in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death. And then continue on. Verse 11, it says, then Judah said to his daughter-in-law, Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. So this is the third son, and he's still maybe a boy. Now keep in mind that these are probably all teenagers. Typically in those days, that as soon as you pass puberty, you're probably getting married pretty quickly. So, and then this younger son is maybe only a few years behind her. So it's not crazy, the age difference. He's just not ready to marry her. But note carefully that Judah sends Tamar back to her parents' house. In other words, I'm not going to take care of you like he's supposed to do under this levirate marriage. He's like, you go over there, and as soon as my younger son grows up, then I will provide him to you. You can marry him, and then that's how we're going to provide for you. But note carefully what Judah says to himself in the latter part of verse 11. He says, he thought he might die too like his brothers. In other words, Judah in his mind is thinking that the reason my 2 older boys have died is something to do with Tamar. It's her fault in some way. He's blind to the reality of his boys and what they're like. Verse 12, after a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. So his wife dies, Judah. Then when Judah had finished mourning, he and his friend Hira, the Adullamite, went up to Timnah to his sheep shears. Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. Now keep in mind that she's been told you need to go to your parents' house and mourn. Judah has already done mourning, ready to get on with business. But she's like, I got an idea. I know how I can get the justice that I deserve, which is the provision. How am I going to sustain myself? What's that going to look like? So she took off her widow's clothes, she veiled her face, covered herself, and sat at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the way to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had grown up, she had not been given to him as a wife. In other words, Judah didn't do what he said he was supposed to do. Judah wasn't providing for her like he said he was going to provide. Now, let's also imagine that, she is figuring out a way to sexually entrap Judah. How does she know that Judah's going to do that? She knows some things about Judah's character. She knows that, okay, his wife has died. Now he's probably, in what I know about him, what I know about his sons, what I know about their family, this plan will probably work. Verse 15, when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her and said, come, let me sleep with you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, what will you give me for sleeping with me? In other words, she asked him, what are you going to pay me? He said, I will send you a young goat from my flock, he replied. But she said, only if you leave something with me until you send it. So she lets him establish the price, but then she establishes the collateral. And then he said, what do you want me to give you? And she answered, your signet ring, your cord, and the staff in your hand, which is essentially in those days like, let me have your driver's license or your ID. Let me hold your passport as collateral until I get that young goat, and then you can have it back. So he gave them to her, slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. She got up and left and removed her veil and put her widow's clothes back on. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Adullamite, in order to get back the items he had left with the woman, he could not find her. And he asked the men of the place, where is the cult prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim? And note closely, too, how he changes it from just prostitute to cult prostitute. A prostitute is just a prostitute. That the purpose is to fulfill sexual desire for sale. Cult prostitute in those days was someone that through sex worshipped a deity, and that was something that they did in those false religions in those times. But in this Canaanite community, he's not saying, hey, where's the prostitute that's over there? He's saying, hey, where's the cult prostitute? I just need to pay her. In other words, in that society, he's kind of covering up what he did in a way that makes it more acceptable to their ears. In other words, they would be judging him for hiring a prostitute. They would not be judging him for hiring a cult prostitute, if that makes any sense. But the other thing that's so crazy about that is from the Jewish standpoint, from the Hebrew standpoint, it's actually the opposite of which one is worse. Using a cult prostitute, in other words, worshiping another god, would be far worse. So I think that's another insight to what's going on with Judah. And they said, there's been no cult prostitute here, they answered. Verse 22. So the Adullamite returned to Judah, saying, I couldn't find her. And besides, the men of the place said, there has been no cult prostitute here. And Judah replied, let her keep the items for herself, otherwise we will become a laughingstock. In other words, this is getting embarrassing, so okay, we'll let her have that. After all, I did send this young goat, but you couldn't find her. I tried to do my part. All right, let's just move on. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has been acting like a prostitute, and now she is pregnant. So just matter-of-factly, there is accusation of this woman. And guys, I hope that you're seeing there is a theme of misogyny throughout this text, the superiority of Judah, a looking down on Tamar. There is immediate accusation. She's pregnant, therefore it must have been evil. She's pregnant, therefore she is hired a prostitute. And what an incredible double standard. He's sending out messengers saying, hey, I need to pay a woman that I hired, cult prostitute. Has anybody seen her? And then he's hearing from messengers, hey, your daughter-in-law in that same location has been a prostitute. Unbelievable sexual double standard here. And then what does Judah say? He says, bring her out, Judah said, and let her be burned to death. Guys, that is unbelievable. Obviously, he deserves the exact same thing. What she's being accused of, he actually did, right? But it's not just kill her, not just take her life, bring that kind of judgment on her. It's actually, I want her to be burned, which is torture plus death. Nowhere else in Scripture that I can think of where we have that kind of prescription of what should be done to someone that deserves the death penalty. He is going right to the worst possible thing. And it says, as she was being brought out, she sent her father-in-law this message. I am pregnant by the man to whom these items belonged. And she added, examine them. Whose signet ring, cord, and staff are these? Like the moment she's coming out, hey, go show these to Judah. Judah recognized them and said, she is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not know her again intimately. Again. Now, the first point that I want to make here is that social injustice is a very, very important thing to God. In fact, from a moral standpoint, it is very, very significant. I think in a lot of our modern way of thinking, especially maybe more on the conservative side of thinking, we think of sexual sin as some of the worst possible sins that there can be. But here we're saying, you see the nuance of this. He's not saying that what she did was okay. After all, what she did was sexual entrapment, right? Among other things, that's not okay. What Judah is saying is that what she did, she is more in the right than I am. What I did was worse. And I'm going to show you a cross-reference in Hosea. Let me see if I can pull this up really quick. Hosea chapter 4. This is a prophet to Israel much later in their history. Chapter 4, verse 14. Listen how this is just totally a callback and a reference to what happened here. He says, I will not punish your daughters when they act promiscuously, or your daughters-in-law when they commit adultery. Now, see, he's not glossing over what they've done. He's still saying it's wrong. But why? He says, for the men themselves go off with prostitutes and make sacrifices with cult prostitutes. People without discernment are doomed. So the first point really here I think that we can say is that social justice is a massive sin. Judah had the means and the way to provide for Tamar. But he refuses that. She gets used by the second son. First, she marries the first son, who turns out to be so evil that God kills him. She gets sexually used by the second son, who God even kills then. And then she gets lied to, put off back to her parents' house rather than being cared for within Judah's household. And then he blames her for what happened to his sons by saying, I'm just going to, I'm going to put her over there and not give my third son to her because I believe that it's her fault that the other two sons, what he did was far worse than what she did. But keeping in mind that God is nuancing it here within the mess of all this evil to make it clear that just because what he did was wrong, that doesn't justify what she did as being okay either. So then the next point I think that we're seeing here is that Judah needs a heart transformation. Judah needs to use the New Testament phraseology, he needs to be born again. What is the darkness in someone's heart that could jump from, even though I know that I've hired a prostitute, my daughter-in-law needs to be burned. What causes that? Remember back in verse 11 where he says, I'm going to send her over there, and he thinks to himself, because she's probably the reason that my older two sons have died. Even though it explicitly says because of their evil, God killed them, and Judah surely knew what his sons were like, yet he is blaming their wife, blaming Tamar for what they have done. It is blame shifting. It is excuses. It is self-justification. And here we have a man who's in a superior way, in a misogynistic way, is looking down on Tamar, blaming her for what's going on in his life, even though these things were all self-inflicted. And how incredibly ironic. She says, examine these. Do you recognize this ring, this staff, and all that? In other words, the ID, guilty. He is caught. In verse 26, it says that he recognized them. And that word for recognize is the same word that Israel used when he saw the robe of Joseph and recognized that it was Joseph's. And the blood, ironically, was from a goat. They killed a goat, put that blood on that, which is the asking price for the prostitution that happened in this passage. And it was Judah was the one who said, hey guys, what profit is it so we kill Joseph? We want to get him out of our life, so let's just sell him into slavery. So not only does he hate his brother, he's guilty of the exact same heart sins, but he's now going to sell him out for greed. That is the heart of Judah, that then eventually now he's blaming everybody else but himself for the problems that he has. But God uses this, that he recognizes not just the identification that he's guilty, but he recognizes his own sin. He says, she is more right than I. He finally comes to a realization of who he is. He has a spiritual breakthrough. And then we see that there's an interesting thing that happens, and the twin boys that are born, and one of them is named Perez, which means breakthrough. And then that boy becomes the one that's in the line of Christ, mentioned in the genealogies in Matthew. And by the way, that word recognize comes again later when the brothers go and see Joseph, who they see as this great leader in Egypt, but they do not recognize him yet. And then when they're negotiating with their brother, Judah says, I will stay here instead of you holding on to my brother. In other words, there is a transformation that happens for Judah, where he is now humbled and willing to sacrifice himself for others, unlike what we see here. So again, I think the two main points that I'm drawing from this is that social injustice is a huge thing to God. It is a significant sin, and the way that the scripture deals with the idea of justice is being in a place where you are capable or required to help people that God brings or are a part of your life, and you refuse to do it. You don't provide for the weak, for the vulnerable. God's eyes in a very special way are on the vulnerable, on the widow, on the orphan. And I believe that when we selfishly ignore, we don't provide the resources that God has given us to provide for them, especially when it's particularly our responsibility, it is a significant sin. And then the second point in summary is that we need a spiritual breakthrough. And it is only by God and a recognition of our sin and seeing it for really what it is, that we come to that breakthrough where we are able now, okay, Lord, I need your gospel. I need the sacrifice of Jesus. Lots of amazing, and I hardly even scratched the surface of all the ways that this passage is pointing to these ideas. I'm looking forward to discussing it with you guys and hearing your thoughts. Reach out to me. If you have anything else to add, I'd love to hear it. Love you guys. Remember to listen to Jesus, do what he says, and remember that you are loved.